Junko Furuta was a bright, hard-working, and well-respected high school student living in Saitama, Japan. She balanced her studies with a part-time job at a plastic molding factory and dreamed of enjoying a graduation trip before beginning work at an electronics store. Friends and teachers described her as responsible, polite, and dependable. She avoided trouble, focused on her future, and was admired for her positive attitude. At first glance, her life reflected the hopes and ambitions of an ordinary teenager preparing for adulthood. Unfortunately, someone at her school viewed her kindness very differently. Hiroshi Miyano developed an unhealthy obsession after Junko rejected his advances. Unable to accept rejection, he saw it as a personal insult rather than a simple decision. Instead of moving on, he gathered several delinquent friends and planned revenge. Their scheme involved staging an attack so Hiroshi could pretend to rescue Junko, earn her trust, and lure her into a dangerous situation without raising suspicion. On November 25, 1988, Junko was cycling home after finishing her shift at work when the plan was put into motion. A boy intentionally forced her off her bicycle before running away, just as Hiroshi appeared and acted like her protector. Although she did not completely trust him, Junko believed accepting his offer to escort her home was safer than remaining alone after the frightening encounter. She had no reason to suspect that the entire incident had been carefully arranged. Instead of taking her home, Hiroshi led Junko to an isolated location where he revealed that he had connections with violent criminals. She was then kidnapped by Hiroshi and 3 accomplices, who decided not to release her because they feared she would report them to the authorities. Rather than allowing her to return to her family, they transported her to a house owned by one of the boy's parents, where she would remain imprisoned for more than 6 weeks, while Junko's family desperately searched for her. The kidnappers forced her to call her parents and falsely claimed that she had run away and was staying safely with friends. Believing her voice and reassured by her words, the investigation slowed considerably. Inside the house, however, Junko was being held against her will and constantly threatened. The kidnappers warned that any attempt to escape or seek help would place her family in danger, leaving her trapped by fear as well as captivity. At first, the boys tried to disguise the situation by pretending Junko was someone's girlfriend, but the act quickly disappeared because nobody questioned them seriously. Several people became aware that she was inside the house, yet almost no one intervened. Fear, intimidation, and indifference combined to create an environment where a terrible crime continued unchecked. Despite multiple opportunities for someone to contact the authorities or help the victim. As the days passed, Junko's physical condition deteriorated dramatically due to repeated assaults, constant violence, lack of proper food, and the emotional trauma of captivity. She became increasingly weak and struggled to perform even basic movements. Despite her worsening condition, her captors continued to isolate and intimidate her while boasting about their crimes to others. The situation reflected not only cruelty but also a shocking disregard for human life and dignity. Even more disturbing was the response of those around the perpetrators. Some people who learned about the situation failed to act, while others chose silence out of fear. At one point, police officers visited the residence after receiving information suggesting that a girl might be inside. However, after speaking briefly with the homeowners and accepting their denial without searching the property, the officers left. That missed opportunity would later become one of the most criticized aspects of the entire case. Despite enduring unimaginable fear, Junko never completely lost hope. On one occasion, when several of her captors were distracted, she managed to reach a telephone and attempted to call the police. For a brief moment, rescue seemed possible. Unfortunately, before she could explain her situation, one of the kidnappers discovered her, took the phone away, and ended the call by pretending it had been a mistake. After this failed escape attempt, security around her became even stricter, and any remaining chance of freedom almost disappeared. The days blended together as Junko remained isolated from the outside world. Unable to contact her family or anyone who could help, her determination to survive remained remarkable, but every passing day made rescue increasingly unlikely. By the 4th week of captivity, Junko's health had declined so severely that she could barely move without assistance. Malnutrition, exhaustion, dehydration, and repeated injuries left her extremely weak. What had begun as a kidnapping had become one of the most prolonged and horrifying criminal cases in modern Japanese history. The suffering she experienced permanently shocked investigators, medical experts, and everyone who later studied the case. Even in those final weeks, there were still chances for someone to intervene. Neighbors noticed unusual activity, visitors came and went, and rumors circulated among people connected to the perpetrators, yet fear, indifference, and poor decisions prevented meaningful action. The failure of individuals and institutions to recognize the seriousness of the situation remains one of the most painful lessons associated with this tragedy. In early January 1989, after more than 40 days of captivity, Junko's condition had become critical. She was physically exhausted and emotionally broken. Yet her captors continued their abuse, instead of seeking medical assistance or accepting responsibility for their actions. Rather than ending the situation by contacting authorities, they allowed it to continue until it reached its tragic conclusion. Following one final series of assaults, Junko died from the overwhelming injuries and trauma she had endured throughout her imprisonment. Instead of reporting her death, the perpetrators attempted to hide their crime by placing her body inside a large, metal drum filled with concrete before abandoning it at a construction site in Tokyo, believing they had destroyed the evidence forever. For a short time, it appeared that the crime might never be solved. However, while police questioned Hiroshi Miyano regarding another unrelated criminal investigation, he mistakenly believed officers already knew about Junko's disappearance. During questioning, he revealed information that led investigators directly to the hidden evidence and ultimately exposed the entire crime. When authorities recovered the drum and conducted a forensic investigation, they confirmed the identity of the victim and uncovered the horrifying truth. Junko's family received devastating news that permanently changed their lives. The emotional impact was overwhelming, particularly for her parents, who struggled with immense grief after learning what had happened to their daughter. The 4 primary perpetrators were arrested and eventually brought to trial because they were juveniles when the crimes occurred. Japanese law initially protected their identities, although journalists later published their names due to the extraordinary nature of the case. Court proceedings shocked the nation as investigators presented evidence demonstrating the scale and brutality of the crimes committed during captivity. Although the offenders were ultimately convicted, many members of the public believed the sentences were far too lenient considering the severity of their actions. The case sparked widespread debate about Japan's juvenile justice system, with critics arguing that rehabilitation had been prioritized over accountability. Even decades later, discussions surrounding the sentences continue whenever the case is remembered. After serving their prison terms, several of the perpetrators were released, and some were later connected to additional criminal activity, further fueling public anger. The fact that individuals responsible for such a notorious crime eventually returned to society remains deeply controversial. Meanwhile, Junko's family continued to live with the lasting emotional consequences of an unimaginable loss. Today, Junko Furuta's story is remembered not only because of the crime itself but also because of the many failures that allowed it to continue. It stands as a powerful reminder of the importance of acting when abuse is suspected, supporting victims without hesitation, and ensuring justice systems protect the vulnerable. More than 3 decades later, her name continues to symbolize the need for compassion, accountability, and the determination to prevent similar tragedies from ever happening again.